Is this the future of architecture? Is this the way architecture is going to be studied? Is this the way people are going to matriculate to and earn their credentials to be architects? Wouldn't it be possible for there to be globally a sudden wave of super popular architect YouTube channels where they say, you, yes, you, if you put in the time, just 15 minutes a day, just 1 hour a day, whatever it is, if you put in the time, if you buy the books, if you buy my book, if you sign up for my course, if you watch my YouTube videos, you, yes, you can be an architect. Maybe you can even be an especially gifted architect, one of the greatest, one of the most influential architects of your generation or in the history of the world. The funny thing is, that's much more plausible than doing what we're now doing with language education on YouTube. I think everyone in this audience, if you really just stop and think about it, and if you can't visualize this, you can do a quick Google search, look at a PDF of what's inside a university level architecture textbook. If you're going to put a swimming pool on the roof, then you have to think about the weight of the swimming pool and how that's distributed throughout the building. You can say it's not rocket science, but the truth is even rocket science isn't rocket science. We could have a sudden wave of teach yourself rocketry videos on YouTube where you get familiar with the physics and the engineering involved in building miniature rockets in your own backyard. In theory, you could create standardized exams so that people can actually go into the rocket science industry with what they've learned on YouTube, what they've learned by signing up and buying the ebook, buying the course, so on and so forth. As wildly implausible as it sounds in our culture to be a self-taught architect or a self-taught rocket scientist, that's much more plausible than being self-taught in any one foreign language, let alone 5 foreign languages, 8 foreign languages, so on and so forth. I think what's happened on a huge scale globally, not just in English-speaking cultures, not just on YouTube, is that the whole world is excited to see something that was formerly expensive and hard to get become free or incredibly cheap and instantly available, easily accessible. Okay? Language education for centuries was very, very expensive. And even if you had the money, it was inaccessible. Not everyone growing up in Ireland had the option of studying Latin. Like even not going back to ancient times, or we could go all the way back to the Dark Ages. You could ask yourself, let's say you were a lad growing up in Ireland in the 10th century and you want to learn Latin, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, we can work through century by century. What were your options? And this is going to sound crazy, guys, but if you think every monastery taught Latin, you're wrong. If you think every monk in every monastery had the opportunity to learn Latin, you're wrong. It's one of the reasons people would, it is one of the reasons people would sign up and go and live in a monastery, was the hope of advancing their own education and learning, especially Latin. And by the way, Ireland is one example. Romania is another, Eastern Europe, history of Christianity in the Dark Ages. But even in the 19th century and the 20th century, the possibility of learning Latin, the possibility of learning Greek, these things, you competed for them. Opportunities were scarce and they were expensive, and it was a huge sacrifice in your own life to do it. Now, the history, frankly, of learning any other language is much shorter. Where you live right now, I have viewers all over the world. So wherever you live right now, for how many centuries has it been possible to study Chinese? You might be shocked at how recently it became possible to learn the Chinese language where you're living, wherever it is. I had a conflict with a professor here, and this is a long story that I'm going to make short. And it went on all night. I mean, we went out to dinner and we went out all that. We became friends, but it began by him being furious at me because he stood up and he said to the class that the history of Asian studies in Western academia began with the American army being in Japan in World War II And then the next step was the creation of an Asian languages unit at the University of Chicago. There was a department in the 1950s. This is the and I said, tell me something. Are you claiming that before World War II, nobody in Europe had studied Sanskrit? Are you claiming that there is no tradition of classical Chinese studies, of translations of Chinese? And, I was just an undergraduate student in the class, and I know he was furious. He was so angry at me, and he was really denouncing and attacking me. And then he gradually figured out, over 15 minutes into that I was really the most brilliant student he'd had in the last 10 years or whatever his career was about. I was the most brilliant student he was going to have. He flipped, and he started really that night. We talked for several hours that night, but he didn't take until the next day. He realized, wow, I'm mad at this student, and actually I should be really appreciative of what the student is bringing to the classroom. But the point is, this myth he was presenting, if you actually look into it, like if you live in Chicago, at what point did it become possible for anyone to learn Chinese in Chicago? Latin has a longer history, right? At what point did it become possible for anyone to learn Japanese in Chicago? What this professor was saying, even though I ridiculed it, even though I criticized him, and he felt ridiculous, which is the point of a good ridicule. Wherever you live, if you live in Milan, if you live in Madrid, if you live in, Athens, Greece, when did it become possible to study any of these languages? You might be shocked at how short the history is. Now, I'm pointing this out for several different reasons. It's unbelievable how conservative our universities are. If you go into any university and ask, well, how do you teach Chinese? The answer you're going to get is, this is the way it has always been done, and this is the way it always shall be done. Really? Really? So, Pimsleur audio cassettes. How long has that technology? They're sitting down with their multiple choice tests using a photocopier and playing an audio cassette or an audio CD. This is your ancient continuous tradition. So language learning methods that require you to have an application on your cell phone to look up Chinese words using handwriting recognition. Yeah? How many years? Aren't there some professors here right now who are old enough to remember the methods used for it? The attitude is, this is the way it has always been, so must it be forevermore. There's this unbelievable conservatism that's hard to jilt out of universities. Language education was, for centuries, incredibly expensive, incredibly hard to qualify for, hard to access, hard to come by. And it was one of the distinctive marks of being a member of a social and political elite, not just in Europe, not just in America. How would you look at the history of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and what being polyglot meant there? And seriously, those guys knew 6 totally different languages. To be a polyglot in the Turkish Empire and the Ottoman Empire, that was not easy, the number of languages you had to master. And then what came with that was a certain station and status in society. How about the British Empire in India? How about the French Empire in Vietnam? Language education has always been linked to grandiose imperialist projects, including the status of Latin within Europe, the status of ancient Greek within Europe. But guys, I've done a lot of research in just the last couple of years about the history of the American Revolution, including kind of notorious figures like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, names that have become famous and names that have been forgotten, people who've disappeared from history. What made a gentleman in that period of American history? Officially, there was no aristocracy, right? What they believed in was natural aristocracy. It's a really powerful concept in the history of the United States of America, and thus, to some extent, in the history of the whole world. Oh, natural aristocracy. If you were in the army, were you a soldier or were you a gentleman? Okay. Knowledge of Latin was crucial to your claim to being a gentleman in that period. The period, let's say 50 years before the American Revolution and 50 years after, right? How much Latin did these guys really know? I'm incredibly cynical about that. Frankly, I think if you just read the books they've left behind carefully or read the letters they've left behind carefully. I think they understood less Latin than I understand French. Nevertheless, right? This is a colony on the outermost cusp of the empire, a colony actively engaged in slave trading, actively engaged in genocide against the indigenous people, and just a colony where life was dirty. You got your hands dirty. Something that really stays with me from the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, just the description of going from one city to another within the 13 colonies, as they then were later the United States of America, just getting from Philadelphia to New York, or from Boston to Philadelphia, these kind of, it was an adventure. You risked your life and you got your hands dirty, and there were no flushing toilets and things, like life was dirty. How do you lift yourself above, the blood and the filth of what life was in the American colonies? Language education was crucial. All right. Obviously, to some extent, I'm ridiculing this, but to some extent, how did Gouverneur Morris become the most powerful man in the United States of America? And he was. I mean, at any given time, if you make a list of who are the most powerful people in American politics, Gouverneur Morris is going to be in the top 5, and he might be number 1. He was one of the most powerful political figures in the United States of America, certainly in New York City, certainly in New York State. This guy was tremendously powerful. He became one of the most important people in the history of the French Revolution, too. Long story I can't get into. Yeah, his claim to speaking French was crucial. For other people, their claim to speaking Spanish was crucial. And for other people still, you see this even in what's written about them, quite apart from what they wrote about themselves, their claim to knowing Latin, their claim to knowing Greek. These were really serious symbols of status, privilege, and authority. And they were purchased at great price. I'm going to digress to tell a story that's not a digression at all. I think, so Melissa's here off camera. Melissa, let me know if you've heard this story before on YouTube. I think I have never told this story before on YouTube, but I might have told it to you in real life. All right. So I knew an old woman with gray hair who was a devotee of the Buddhist religion. So she was a white Western woman who had lived an extraordinary life. Like, let's be real here. To say someone is of above average intelligence, what's your definition of average and above average? I mean, it's kind of, but this was not a stupid woman at all. And she had lived in several different continents in the world and had seen many things and done many things in her time. She was an experienced, interesting person, not a genius. Studied several languages, not a genius. Just saying. I think she was a person of above average intelligence, but as even this anecdote will show, in some ways she was struggling with the finitude of her own intellect and energy. She had grown gray in years by the time I had this conversation with her. Quite likely she's dead now. Now I think about it. I haven't Googled her for telling this anecdote. And she said to me angrily, she said, when I was with the Peace Corps doing humanitarian work, they gave us a short course for the Tagalog language of the Philippines. And that course made it easy. They gave us a course, Tagalog for Dummies, and that simplified everything and got rid of all the grammar and got rid of all the complexity, and made it so a child could learn it. And then we just practiced that again. And then we went out and did this humanitarian work, and we all spoke Tagalog. Yeah, you could all say, "Where's the bathroom?" What do you mean by you spoke Tagalog? Could you read the newspaper in Tagalog? So leaving that aside. And she said to me angrily, she said, why can't you make a book like that for Pali? Why can't you scholars of ancient Buddhism? Why can't you give me a short course in Pali? Why can't you give me Pali for Dummies? Why can't you take this language and this literature and this philosophy and make it easy so that everyone can learn it, so that someone like me can learn it? And I said to her, and she was really angry. Now, I could digress here to talk about the psychology of why she was so angry. I do think, in part, she was someone who had accomplished remarkable things with her life, just remarkable explorations. As has already been indicated, at a young age, she was with the Peace Corps and went to the Philippines and a few other places in Southeast Asia. She'd done humanitarian work. I think she'd climbed her share of mountains, both literally and figuratively. But when it came to language learning, she didn't understand. She couldn't accept, why does it have to be so hard? She had the world's greatest motivation to learn the Pali language specifically, which is that she thought that Pali was the sacred language of the scriptures of the Buddha, and she has a religious fervor for this, you know? So you can't ask someone to be more highly motivated to learn language, but she had found, I don't know how many times she tried, in trying to learn the language, she'd found again and again, it was just impossible for her. Anyway, so she was really angry. And I think that anger reflects years of struggle and disappointment and, her own awareness that she's a talented, hardworking person. She has some intelligence to bring to this and some humiliation and frustration that despite her intelligence and despite the depth of her religious conviction and fanaticism, frankly, wasn't enough. This was still just too hard for her to do. And I remain completely calm, and my sense of humor has changed a bit over the years. But with the laconic sense of humor I had at that time, I said to her, easy. You want it to be easy. And I was speaking softly, intentionally, to get her to, kind of, why would it be easy? I said, tell me something. You ever read Aristotle? Can you make Aristotle easy? You want to read Aristotle in ancient Greek? Is it going to be easy? If I could take Aristotle and make it easy, would you want to read that version of Aristotle? If it's going to be, I can do that for you. I can take Aristotle, I can break it down, I can make it easy. I can give you Aristotle for dummies. But it's not going to be Aristotle anymore, is it? Shakespeare. Why can't Shakespeare be easy? It wouldn't be Shakespeare anymore if it's easy, right? You want to be able to read philosophy in this language. You want to be able to talk about and debate like epistemology and ethics and metaphysics in Pali. That's the level. Like, you don't want to ask, where's the bathroom? You don't sure, any language, if that's all you want, is phrase book. Where's the bathroom? I'm thirsty. I'm hungry. Okay. Basically any language in the world, that's going to be pretty easy. Okay. Why would that be easy? It can't be easy. And if it were easy, it wouldn't be worth doing. It wouldn't be worth doing at all. And again, it's to her credit. She calmed down, and she saw the truth in what I was saying. And I don't think that was easy for her to accept. She was an old woman, and I think she was facing up to the possibility that she was going to die and go to her grave without ever reading the sacred word of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. You heard of him? Now, the truth is she could have learned Pali at that level within 5 years. It's just, if English is your first language, Pali is not that hard. Sanskrit is not that. It's not. 5 years of hard work, sure, totally. And she had more than 5 years to live. She totally could have done it. But it's not easy. And I'm not going to make it easy for you. Nobody is going to make it easy for you, right? Now, religion brings in other dimensions to this. But I think what I said in the first 10 minutes of this video, you can still see would apply to the Sanskrit, Pali, so on and so forth. Something incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult to access, right? Then the internet suddenly, seemingly, makes it available for free, makes it accessible to everyone, right? So, books that genuinely, like, you just couldn't get before. You could not get a copy of these books at any price. Books that were incredibly expensive. Forms of education that only a few of the most famous universities in the world could offer, like Harvard School of World Religions and, Harvard School of World Religions used to be famous. Harvard School of Divinities. Cambridge and Oxford, just a few. Where can you learn Sanskrit? Where can you learn Pali, right? There was the tantalizing sense that language education was now cracked open and made available to all at the click of a mouse button, or maybe for 3 easy payments of $5.99 instead of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, years of your life lost to an authoritarian institution, right? Big fundamental turning point in history. Or was it? You know, what happened to cinema didn't happen to language education. What happened to recorded music, vinyl albums? Look at the cost of a vinyl album. Look at downloading an MP3, a music file from the internet, legally or illegally. There's a cost to both. The internet's not completely free, right? But you can have every song the Beatles ever recorded, right? With a few mouse clicks. Again, even legally, even buying these things and paying the fee for it's not that much money, right? It seemed to people that this was happening with language education. Now, why the excitement? Why is this scam even possible? Like, you can't scam people if they don't want something from you and they don't think it's attainable, right? Like, I can't really scam you through education in architecture. There is no architecture scene on YouTube, and there could be. It's so much easier to learn to be an architect. Are you kidding me? Right? There's no scene on YouTube for teaching yourself law, teach yourself how to be a barrister, how to be a lawyer. It's so much easier. Dude, what the fuck do you think is harder than learning Chinese? What the fuck is harder than that? What needs more help than that, It became possible for this scam subculture to evolve, right? Because it was thinkable, because the fantasy was believable. Let's get into briefly what the fantasy is. Anyone in the audience can comment. I do see your comments coming in, but Melissa, you also count as a member of the audience.
You asked me if I remembered you telling that story.
Yeah, it's the first time that's been on the tube.
I think so.
Yeah. If you become an architect, what do you think that's going to do for your sex life? Like, real talk. Well, it could be art history. Melissa remembers we took this walk around an art gallery, and she was shocked. Melissa was making some bumpkin comments about how she had no understanding of these paintings, and I was shocked, and I was able to give a lecture on each. No, I know who painted this. I know what its historical significance is. I know what school of art this comes from. I can talk for you, 15 minutes or something for each of these paintings. No, I have a background in art history. Well, to the right people, that's sexy. Being able to give a tour of an art gallery. I think there are a whole lot of women who are looking for a man who's an architect or something like an architect, right? I think there are a whole lot of women. Let's say you work in construction. Let's say your actual job is mixing and pouring cement. Okay, but what if you had the same education as an architect? Like, your actual job is still pouring cement, but you did a self-taught architecture degree. I mean, the number one fantasy fueling the polyglot phenomenon on YouTube and across the internet is the fantasy that you will get laid. It is the fantasy that you will be appreciated and desired by members of the opposite sex, or if you're gay, members of the same sex, across the world somewhere, whether that's in Japan, China, Thailand, what have you. And I have seen videos pointing out that even within the Muslim world, where obviously women have a lot less sexual liberty, even within the Muslim world, and the study of languages that exist only in Muslim majority countries, you can still see this sex tourism element, forcing it forward. See, that's clearly one part of the fantasy. Reciprocal with that, though, maybe we have to recognize language no longer has the power that it had for Ben Franklin, right? Again, I don't think Ben Franklin could read a sentence in Latin or Greek. I don't. I think his language, it's completely phony. It's this myth people made up about him, and he probably encouraged the myth to a significant extent also, because he wanted to present himself as a man of letters and an esteemed statesman and all these things. And he had no formal education whatsoever. His whole life story is very well documented. And if you read his autobiography, you get to read about just how little education he had. He worked with his hands. He was an autodidact, we cannot say also, but he wanted to be perceived as a great scientist, a great statesman, so on and so forth. And he was, to whatever extent he was creating a myth. The myth was very convincing for people. And a crucial element of the myth was that he could read Latin and Greek. Does anyone give a fuck in 2022 if you can read Latin and Greek? All right. Well, guys, I don't exactly suffer from low self-esteem. When I was in university, when I was a teenage male, all kinds of women wanted to fuck me. That was really my experience. My experience really was pretty much being the top of the food chain. And we could get into the reasons as to why that is. And maybe that reflects something really pathetic about these women. Like, I'm not saying it's because I'm so great. Maybe it reflects something really pathetic about the other men who were my de facto competition, whether or not I wanted to compete with them, right? Like, there were a lot of women who were tired of dating a schlemiel who sits on the couch and watches sports on TV. Men whose lives revolve totally around sports and action movies and video games in which you shoot people in the head again and again. Like, whatever it is, like, to some extent it's the other men, to some extent it's the women. I'm not saying this reflects anything great about me. But guys, I don't think I grew up in a culture where my social status, even in this sense, would be improved by knowing Latin, where it would be improved by knowing Greek, where it would be improved by knowing French. Not at all. In Canada, it's allegedly bilingual country. Nobody gives a fuck if you speak good French. Nobody. It's pitiful. The state of bilingualism is good. Nobody cares. Won't improve your sex life in any way. And again, I'm using sex life really as a relatively easy, tangible standard for a more complex analysis of your standing in life politically. You guys know, politically, I was involved. I used to go to City Hall. I was involved in the Green Party. I went to different kinds of political events. Do you think my social standing was in any way tied to my ability to speak Latin, Greek, French? My knowledge of, frankly, any literature, like whether you think that is ancient Greek literature, like in that sense that we're, being well-read. No. And look, you can get into a whole discourse about this. What's happened on the left, the rise and fall of Marxism. Marxists didn't value knowledge of Latin or knowledge of Greek. And even in the post-Marxist era, the effects of Marxism are indelible on our political climate. That's really what killed the respect for the Greco-Latin tradition. It died with Marxism. Nobody in the post-Marxist era, defines their own importance and worth in terms of being well-read in ancient Latin and Greek sources, and nor in anything else. There wasn't some other canon of literature that replaced it. I'll say, nobody gave a fuck whether or not I could speak French. Nobody thought it was like a requirement to be a kind of upwardly mobile, erudite person to have a high level of ability in French. I think this is still true throughout Canada, And beyond that, okay, so now what do you want to talk about? You want to talk about Chinese? You want to talk about Sanskrit? Like, what are we going to talk? What other languages matter? And yes, it's easy to say, oh, Americans and Canadians were just such a culture of I don't know, lunch bucket rednecks or whatever. Oh, we're such an unrefined culture of knuckle draggers or something. It's easy to beat up on ourselves. I think this is really a global phenomenon. I don't think this is peculiar to the United States of America. And certainly, what do you think it's better in Australia? What do you think? What does language have to do with social status? Well, I'm pointing out the world that existed around the time of the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, blah, 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 that has died. That social significance given to language died. However, what the YouTube polyglot phenomenon illustrates is the emergence of a new fantasy, right? Now, because the old one, it's also a kind of fantasy. Like, I think millions of young men around the world for a period of at least 150 years They read about Benjamin Franklin, and they studied hard at school because they wanted to be something like Benjamin Franklin one day. Millions of young men. He was an icon for several generations. And millions of young men studied science and studied Latin and studied Greek because there was a sense in which they wanted to be like Benjamin Franklin. Not exactly the same. Like, this is what it is to be a distinguished gentleman who's taken seriously, despite being born poor and being a workman, earning your living in a manual trade, with your hands, So anyway, I just say I do think he had that kind of. There was a kind of fantasy. Now, for what percentage of people did the fantasy work out? Well, I'd point out that fantasy is based on working your way up within the culture you're born into. That's interesting in several different ways. I think the prevalent fantasy now that the whole Polyglot YouTube scam preys upon, it both feeds and feeds upon, is instead fundamentally an escapist fantasy, right? The escapist fantasy is that you can run away to Japan and be somebody special and be something special, right? You can teach yourself Japanese and you can run away to Japan and start a new life. Now, who is you in this equation? What if we're talking about a young man born and raised in Morocco, Muslim family, Muslim majority culture? Doesn't really matter if I say Morocco or I say Indonesia, frankly, but let's stick with Morocco. What if you're a young man born in Morocco and growing up, you watch these cartoons that show you a society in Japan? Just implicitly, it shows you how profoundly different Japanese society is from your own. And I know all those cartoons, the cartoons that are for children made in Japan, there is a heavily censored version of them for the Muslim world. And to my knowledge, the biggest single market is Malaysia. Like, they think, okay, we're going to do this version, we're going to censor it, we're going to have a Malaysian version for Malaysia. But I believe they're distributed throughout, all around the world. People end up seeing them in Saudi Arabia and all over the place. Regardless of what the actual marketing intent is, what the economic rationale is for making these specially censored versions. But you'll notice, generally speaking, in the Muslim culture throughout the world, there are some things that are taboo, like showing your bare feet to another man, and they'll be blurred out. So they'll blur out the feet of the character. You're like, what? Why would anyone? You understand if it's nudity or something. Why would you blur out the feet? So you can tell if you're watching, quote unquote, the Muslim version of a Japanese cartoon. But okay, what if the kid you're talking about grows up Muslim in a Muslim majority household, society, etc., in Morocco, and he has this vision of a different life in a different society in Japan? The first time I really thought about this, growing up, I had black friends. There were a lot of black people in the specific neighborhood in Toronto I lived in. That's not true of all of Toronto, and it's not true of all of Canada, really. It's just that neighborhood. We did have a lot of black people. And, I saw that there had been in the 1970s this big interest among black people in kung fu movies. So these were mostly Hong Kong kung fu movies. A little bit of interest in Japanese culture among black people, but mostly Hong Kong Chinese culture for that generation, 1970s generation. And then I saw that it had kind of died out. Like, people, generally the black people, they'd ceased to be fascinated by East Asian culture in this way. The kung fu craze kind of came and went. And then Dragon Ball Z was translated into English. And Dragon Ball Z, specifically with urban black people and urban Latino people, Hispanic people, and there was a separate Spanish translation of that. Wow, you could see their huge response, their huge enthusiasm for this cartoon, and for then now this is Japanese culture being commercialized. Okay, so again, I did have a couple black friends growing up, and also I had just black acquaintances, and there were a lot of black people around me. Okay, and I knew young black people, high school and university, who had very powerful escapist fantasies, and it is understandable. Like, they wanted to escape Canadian society. They wanted to escape their own family in Toronto. They wanted to escape Canadian culture generally, and then the subculture within Canada that they were born into and didn't have a choice about, right? And again, like, sorry, most of these people, sorry, each black person was a different story, but yeah, a lot of them, the family is very, very Christian. It's very domineering, Christian household that, right, but regardless of the particular religion, obviously some of them were raised in Muslim families too, and so on and so forth. But being born into this culture, you fundamentally don't like. Japanese culture presented an enticing alternative. It presented something for your fantasy life to latch onto in a way that Cuba didn't, in a way that the Soviet Union didn't, in a way that Mao Zedong's China didn't, and they all tried. They all tried. There was a huge movement to try to convert American blacks to communism and to convince them that the workers' paradise and socialism, that they had perfect equality for the races, and you wouldn't be oppressed in Russia the way you were in the United States of America. And you can read about it. Many books have been made, a couple documentary films too, I think, about black Americans who actually went to the Soviet Union and lived there permanently. Some of them now, their grandchildren are alive, who are now, whatever, 3/4 Russian and 1/4 African American, or whatever the story is, the different cases. There were versions of an earthly paradise presented to African Americans. And in case you've forgotten Malcolm X, there was a whole generation also of black radicals who were, the wishful thinking they were engaged in was that there was a better society, quite literally, in Saudi Arabia, that converting to Islam and then going on the Hajj, going on a pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, seeing the center of the Muslim world, seeing the status of black people in that society in contrast to the United States of America, that was supposed to be the escapist fantasy, right? And this also, of course, entails language learning, right? Yeah, look, okay, I'll be self-critical for a second here. We've got some comments about learning Pali and so on. Okay, was there an escapist fantasy for me in running away from Canada to Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka? Sorry, they might as well be one place from my perspective, because the life I was going to lead involved all of them when it moves to this. Was there an escapist element? No, look, for me personally, the answer is no. I don't have to get into a big monologue about my own psychology and motivation. But I can tell you this. The fantasy for me was that I was going to have colleagues, was that I was going to know other intellectuals variously doing research, humanitarian work, et cetera, that I was going to know people and live my life with people, and that they were going to be sober, hardworking people, because I grew up in a language, pardon me, I grew up in a cultural context dominated by drunks and drug addicts. And sorry, again, this is obviously for many African Americans, it's part of their experience growing up. I just heard an interview with an African American where he was reflecting on his life and talking about how much it really damaged him to grow up surrounded by drug addicts in the way that he did. But it doesn't mean you can be white, you can be any ethnicity and grow up and recognize, wow, almost everyone around me is some kind of drunk or drug addict. So okay, I can go to another country, learn another language, and I can be part of a community. This is literally a religious community that is defined by, a commitment to sobriety and a certain kind of intellectual endeavor. You can call that an escapist fantasy, but at any rate, it was a fantasy. I think it's not quite the same as what we're talking about here. But yeah, I was going to say a lot of us are born into a culture we fundamentally want to escape from. And then the marketing of polyglottery and of easy, instant, cheap, or free language education on the internet fits into this fantasy life of the 21st century adult. Really, it's worth pointing out, it's not just young people. Yes, what you see on YouTube is predominantly young people. You think there aren't middle-aged people signing up for this fantasy? You think there aren't people in retirement? I think it gets to people at every every age and every stage of life. And that's where a lot of the money will come from, is older people who want to turn over a new leaf and lead a better life, lead a different life, so on and so forth. Anyway, this type of escapist fantasy has come and gone again and again, whether it was pushed by a religious ideology or a secular political ideology like communism, you know. And I think that this scam within a scam, this polyglot YouTube phenomenon, it's kind of successfully put together several of the most intoxicating elements of that kind of escapist fantasy, intentionally or unintentionally, like even if it's mere happenstance. And it's ended up creating a subculture that's qualitatively and quantitatively different from anything that's happened with teach yourself architecture, teach yourself law, or even teach yourself math, right? Now, let's be clear. I've mentioned this before, but I once saw a book for sale on Amazon. It was just advertised to me. I was not searching for it, about teaching yourself advanced math. And, the book description, it said, hey, you don't need to enroll in university courses to build up the skills you need to do advanced algebra. I think it was both algebra and calculus. I forget. In this book. So, this experienced professor and math educator gives you a series of explanations and exercises that you can do every day. And within 2 years or something, you can learn everything you should have learned in high school and then go much further and really understand advanced mathematics. I can imagine I just kind of sat there thinking about it, because in that case, I completely believe it. Like, I completely believe that just for a person of average intelligence, without that much work, if you put in the work every day, you can build up your ability in math. Nobody does. Like, that is not even 1 in a million. It is incredibly rare as a hobby for someone to even do long division, let alone advanced trigonometry or something. Nobody does that. There is no scene on YouTube monetizing the fantasy that you can teach yourself to be really good at math. And the irony is you can. The irony is that works. Like, there's no doubt in my mind you can do that. You can get good at math, right? And instead, there's this really powerful fantasy connected to language education. And again, no matter how expensive you think this is, internet-based, YouTube-based language education, it is pennies. Like, both in terms of time and in terms of money, these are really low costs compared to what traditional language education was, whether inside the university or otherwise. How do you calculate the cost of going to live in a monastery in order to learn a language? How do you calculate the cost of joining the army in order to learn a language? Like, this is, even if it's some scenario in which you don't pay anything, the loss of years of your life and the contractual obligations in exchange. So the uniqueness of the language learning fantasy, again, that it's so unlike architecture, that it's so unlike math, it's so unlike everything else. Even if, so look, one of the differences, if you get good at math, who's going to sleep with you? Who's even going to flirt with you? Like, how is this going to improve your sex life? And again, I'm interested in your sex life as an indirect indication of something much more complex and political about your social status, your social standing. So, like, I used to lobby City Hall. All right. If you go to City Hall, is being good at math going to open any doors for you? Like, I'm saying, I don't even think knowing French will here in Canada, like being really bilingual and fluent with English and French. No one's going to say, oh, wow. And knowing Latin or knowing Greek, it won't now, but it did a couple hundred years ago, right? If you went to City Hall and you were a hardworking, assiduous person who could really quote Latin and Greek, that was extremely esteemed. That really was significant for your status at City Hall, right? But as I say, sexual status is an indirect and imperfect token of this. Nobody believes they can get laid by hitting the books and really getting good at math, right? Okay. But what about architecture, right? Even architecture, right? Learning about architecture, art history. It seems like nothing else can be commercialized in quite the same way language education can be, and that language education has. So I'm going to take a moment now to read your comments, guys. If you want to type something, you want me to see it, that's a good time to do. And Melissa, if you want to jump in and tell me I'm wrong about everything, it's a good time. Hit me.
Here, it's a question. Do you think for people like Benjamin Franklin that this played a role in their sex lives?
Yes.
Historically.
Yes, absolutely. And Ben Franklin did sleep around. We know a fair bit about his sex. Absolutely. Absolutely. At that time, it was really a man's world. But, his status in gentlemen's clubs, his status in different royal scientific societies, and so on, had everything to do with his being able to front on knowing these languages. Sure. And even his being sent on that mission to France. Sure. But I mean, both the appearance of his erudition and the reality of it, sure, it had everything to do with this. Yeah. Go on, yeah.
Yeah, one other thing that
But he was ugly. No offense. Ben, is it too soon? Is it too soon to admit that Ben Franklin was both fat and ugly? Okay, can we? No. Is it too soon? And he had kids out of wedlock. Anyway, go on, yeah.
Right. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to ask, or at least to talk about, is I remember maybe a couple years ago first thinking about this because you brought it up to me, and I felt stupid thinking, wow, how had I gotten to like, I don't know, 27 without really thinking about the origin of the term bachelor's?
Right.
What does this mean? Like, okay, I have a bachelor's in English.
Right.
Okay. Well, there's like obvious.
Right. So what's the etymology and why is that the term we use rather than something else? Right.
Yeah. So it relates kind of to this idea of you're just saying that he was a member of gentlemen's clubs, right? It's,
yes. Yes.
Bachelor's clubs, young men, young educated men.
Yes. Right. And he continued to be as he became an old man too. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, but I mean, he lived in a time before even telephones and so on. But very literally, the places he was allowed to sit, the tables he was allowed to sit at, and so on. Sure. And again, that was entirely self-taught. That was entirely through his own. He didn't even have high school. He didn't even have primary school. It was just through self-education. Yeah. So no, and think about how different his life would be if he just remained an illiterate worker, someone who just worked with his hands. So it changed everything. Yeah. Now, anyway, it's an extreme example, and I am not out here making such promises to anyone. But I'm saying that was a fantasy, I think, for innumerable young men born in disadvantaged circumstances, that they too could be in some way like Benjamin Franklin. That kind of upward mobility, including sexually, that could become possible for them through hard work. Oh, and by the way, he had his own best-selling books full of those types of aphorisms. So he published a calendar that was not really a calendar in our sense. I think it's now referred to as Benjamin Franklin's Almanac. And he had these pithy statements of worldly wisdom about being scholarly and sober and hardworking and saving your money and so on. And so he, didn't take a lot of imagination to figure out what the Ben Franklin formula for success was. So there's some questions here about specific languages. I don't mind answering them just because they're brief, but it's not really the topic of this video. Someone asks if it wouldn't be easier to learn Sanskrit first and then work on Pali. So to do Sanskrit first and then Pali. Why don't you learn Italian first and then learn Spanish? Be depressing as hell. And the resources you have for Sanskrit are religious as hell. So, you will probably lose interest and never get there. I have never met one person who gained advanced ability in Pali by working on Sanskrit first. I have met and I have seen evidence of a lot of people who had PhDs who claimed they had ability in Pali who never got over the hump that separates Sanskrit from Pali. But, is it impossible? No, of course not. You could learn Italian first and then learn Spanish. But if you're really passionate about learning Spanish, learn Spanish. Like, it doesn't make sense. My point is here, Italian and Spanish are similar languages, of course. But it doesn't make sense to study Italian first to help you with learning Spanish. If you want to learn Italian, and you learn Italian, Anyway, sorry, that's a short answer, but that for someone watching this video, that might be important. And obviously that can apply to a lot of other languages. Well, look, we have Korean mentioned next. Is it easier to learn Japanese first and then learn Korean? Is it easier to learn Chinese first and then learn Korean? If what you want to learn is Korean, Like it would just be madness to suggest any other language as a means to learning Korean. So it's a generalized problem. But I mean, if it doesn't make sense to me if you say yes. If you tell me that you're so passionate about learning Korean that you learned Vietnamese first, it's just, what sense does that make? What, you're going to learn Korean via Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese? It doesn't make sense. And that does, I mean, I know people are put in those positions institutionally. I've mentioned this story before. I knew a young woman, and she had been forced to learn Vietnamese in order to learn Cambodian because that was more profitable for her university. They could make more money that way. So, but no, it's don't reason your way into this. Don't make excuses to the point where this seems to make sense, because it really doesn't make sense. So we have someone in the audience who's in Vancouver. Shout out to distant Vancouver, far away, exotic Vancouver. And he or she says he's teaching Korean moms English as a second language. These would be Korean people who are already living in Canada. And he says they want to advance too quickly. They can't even sit through an academic English class. They want to go to college to immigrate, but can't put in the effort to memorize advanced vocabulary. I mean, it's interesting because people can now, through the cellular phone, through computer technology generally, they can cope with living in a foreign country, in a foreign language, without ever really learning that language forever, right? In a way that they couldn't in the past. Because, what do you really need to be able to say? You go to the grocery store and you say, I'm looking for tahini, and you don't know the word for tahini in the language, but you can use your phone. You can live in a kind of constant reliance on computer translation. You can get by. And these Korean moms, they may have been living in Canada for years. I don't know. It doesn't give background on how long they've been here. But you could live in Canada for 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, and never really learn English while, your cellular phone, your laptop computer, etc., while Google Translate helps you get by. So that's certainly, I just say, many parts of the world, India is probably the best example. The importance of knowing English has decreased, not increased. And you might think, oh, that's paradoxical. Are you really saying that 50 years ago, the English language was more important in India than it is today? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's possible now to live your whole life just speaking Tamil in a way it wasn't 50 years ago. There was a lot of pressure within India. Like, people who never planned to leave India still needed to learn English or learn a certain amount of English to get ahead within India. And that's decreasing and disappearing. But certainly, and look, I could live in Japan now without ever learning Japanese. I have actually studied Japanese at university, but obviously I could get around Japan just using my cell phone and so on and so forth. So yeah, computer technology enables education, but to a much greater extent, computer technology enables ignorance. Now, I remember the difference. I remember when I was a child and it was really respected for you to remember precise historical dates and precise figures, and how that kind of knowledge came to be despised when it was instantly available through Google. Nobody needs to know the exact year something happened anymore from memory. But before Google, before the internet, if you didn't know the year something happened, what are you going to do? Walk to a library, find the right paper book on the shelf, take down the paper book, right? There was really a value placed on not just generalized memorization, but being able to summon up very specific information from your own memory. Now, actually, another example of that was the role of a lawyer. One of the main things that was prized about a lawyer was remembering the specifics of laws and even the section code and title. Like, oh no, under 14E, it says this. That was what was really valued about a lawyer. So today that's disappeared also. So again, computer technology enables education. It also disables education. It enables people living without education. It undermines the value of certain types of knowledge, certain types of expertise. I've seen that to a massive, massive extent, you know. So look, sorry, this is a very simple question, but it's a great question from Henry Gann. Shout out to Henry. Henry says, quote, "Who learns languages? Who reads books? I remember looking at statistics, and this is very much pre-internet. This is in my youth, for how many nonfiction books per year people actually read in different cultures around the world. So it was basically a study like how many books do people buy, then how many of those books are fiction, how much are nonfiction. And at that time, the country that read the most books in the world was South Korea. They were the most actively literate culture in the world. I do not know if that's true today at all. I do not know to what extent those statistics exist today, to what extent that's really knowable. And I just mentioned nonfiction is also a bit misleading because nonfiction includes technical manuals, it includes things you have to buy for work that it's not really what we think about when we say reading nonfiction. You know, the tax code is nonfiction. You know, so you know you'd need fairly detailed statistics. However, obviously, with the advent of purchasing books on the internet, in principle, it should be easier to know precisely what kind of books people are buying. But you can also just survey people and try to get honest answers about how much they're reading. It is not a minor or trivial thing to say that the vast majority of people read nothing unless they are compelled to read it, whether that is compulsion by a university classroom, it's compulsion by their employment, their job requires them to read something, or compulsion by a religious authority figure. Like when you take the Bible out of the equation, how much reading is anyone doing per year? And the answer is practically zero. Almost nobody is reading anything. And, you know, look, what are you doing with the next 5 years of your life? What if you wanted to challenge that? What if you wanted to change that in a way, big or small? You know, I used this example 100 times. I don't think anyone reacts to it positively. Look at what Mothers Against Drunk Driving accomplished. You know, what if a small organization could really change culture, could really change the law, could really change the world? You know, like it's not that edgy, it's not that provocative. I mean, defund the police is pretty fucking edgy and provocative, and you saw how many millions of dollars were donated to that. Well, what if, and you know, and by the way, if you haven't seen my videos about it, I am a critic of the defund the police movement. I do not support the defund the police movement. But anyway, it's still an interesting and important example in our times. You know, obviously, the Gilets jaunes in France, a very edgy, a very provocative movement. Who really wants to donate money to support that movement when they're smashing up, you know, shops and restaurants and tearing up the paving on the street and so on? Pardon me. I'm a critic of the Gilets jaunes, but I also sympathize that they are fundamentally a pro-democracy movement. So I have a mix of criticism and praise for a movement like that. But okay, if what you really want is to improve the quality of education in our society, if that's really what you want to do, if you want to take a society of semi-literates, you know, and really improve the quality and quantity of reading people are doing, the intellectual caliber of your society, look at the difference that Mothers Against Drunk Driving made and ask yourself in the next 5 years, do you think you could make a difference like that? I think you have a shot. And I think you have a shot whether you're in Madrid or you're in Mongolia. Like this is not, I'm not stereotyping Americans here. This is not an American problem. I've lived in England. Okay. Like if you think the British are more intellectual than Americans, you're wrong. I would say less so. Just being real with you. I think the intellectual caliber of people in England is at a lower level than the United States of America. So again, so some of these questions are really, really short and simple, but they are actually kind of interesting to me. From Clouds, quote, do you think language learning is generally the most difficult intellectual endeavor? So I'll answer first, but Melissa, you might have something to say about this. Like a really shallow answer is to ask seriously, what is harder, than learning a second language, a third language. Like, really, what's harder? Okay, this is what I have to say about it. One, learning a second language is unnatural. And this is not an appeal to language fallacy. We have a certain very finite, evolved capacity to learn language that begins while breastfeeding as an infant, to learn language just by listening and observing as a small child. We have no innate capacity to be polyglots. It is a very unnatural thing to think in just two languages, let alone 3, 4, 5, 8, 12 languages, right? You are really working against nature. Now, again, not an appeal to nature fallacy. With physical fitness, if you if you want to be lean and muscular, there's a certain point at which that is natural. You're working with nature. Like if you just jog, if you just eat a healthy diet and go jogging, you are going to look muscular to some extent, athletic to some extent, lean to some extent, right? If you want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, if you want to look like a competitive bodybuilder, we're into something unnatural. You're really not evolved to have muscles hanging off your body that way, the way, the most successful bodybuilders in the world were. And I think for everyone, it's unachievable without the use of steroids, like that, at that level of competition, that level of size and mass, so it's unnatural by more criteria than one. But even if you were born with some genetic anomaly that allows you to gain that much muscle just through exercise without use of drugs, things can be natural up to a certain point in the spectrum and then become unnatural, meaning up to a certain point, you're working with nature, and then beyond a certain point, you're working against it. So why is learning a language so difficult? This is one part. It is fundamentally unnatural. Waking up at 5:30 in the morning to hit the books and study a language is unnatural. It's never going to be natural. It's never going to feel good. Never. All right? Jogging can feel good. Swimming can feel good. Sports, athleticism can feel good. This is always going to cut against your nature. Okay. The other thing is this. If I'm having an in-depth conversation about the history of Buddhism, history, politics, philosophy, the amount of time I have to think about my answer, just in a conversation, it might seem like I'm answering really quickly, but if you measure the number of seconds, I actually have a pretty long time. I listen to the other person and I sit there thinking, and I get to put together a reply. The challenge with spoken language, any language, including your own first language, that you may still be improving your ability in for decades. I speak English better now than I did 10 years ago. And I'm a mean old man. Melissa, you was talking about that earlier today. Just her ability at verbal communication has improved and so on, in her first language even, okay. When I speak Chinese, if I go back to speaking Japanese, Laotian, Thai, Cambodian, okay, it's so fast. Listening comprehension and speaking ability and putting together a sentence and speaking it, it's so fast. It's fast compared to weightlifting at the gym. I can do 30 push-ups and then sit there and rest for a few seconds, you know what I mean? And I can think about what exercise I'm going to do next. And it may seem ridiculous, but to compare it to physical exercise, but you can space out and slow down physical exercise, right? And with language, there is no space and no time. Either you can answer instantly, and either you can listen, like have listening comprehension instantly, or not at all, right? So these are two different categories within which I think, yes, language learning is the most difficult intellectual endeavor. I'm going to give you a third. Maybe I can keep going. So I don't know, Melissa feels some kind of way about this. I was talking to a colleague, a guy who's also a YouTuber and who also does language education on YouTube specifically. And he's a much, much bigger channel than mine, as people say, more subscribers and more viewers than I do. And he was saying just kind of casually, like, oh, these days it's so easy to make a friend on the internet and have people help you study the language. People help you through, Skype or other teleconferences. Oh, you just make friends and they help you study language. And I said to him, I wasn't being mean, but I was being very serious about it. Like, What are you talking about? Like, you can study a language for 10 years and never have one person really help you. Like, you can wander in the desert for years trying to find one friend, one colleague, one person who cares enough about you to help you with the language. And, that can be learning Laotian in Laos, it can be learning Chinese in China. And whether it's on the internet or in real life, like, it is just not the case that people will help you for free. And the work involved in language learning, it's very difficult. I mean, you can ask yourself right now, do you want to help someone else learn English for free? Really? It's incredibly rare. So this is another category of unique and special difficulty that pertains to language. And I can only compare it to theater. All right. If I really want to do Shakespeare, I can come here on YouTube and start doing monologues from Shakespeare, right? But there are some aspects of theater where I must have other people. I have to have a group of people who can work together. So a special difficulty with language learning is having encouragement, participation, and help from other people. Now, I'm just being honest with you. I don't know how much that's true with math. Maybe it is true with math too. Maybe you really need to work with other people. Like, maybe that helps a lot with math. I'm just saying hypothetically, like the social component, the cooperative component, and even the competitive component. With language learning, it's crucial. And I've learned languages totally alone, studied several languages. I worked really, really hard, totally alone. It's horrible. So that is a special difficulty that adds on to language learning as an intellectual endeavor. And there's no doubt all three of these difficulties, they fuel the enthusiasm, the feeding frenzy for language education and polyglot over here on YouTube. This is part of what's going on. People don't want to be alone. Yeah. Melissa on the microphone. Sit.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, okay, when I was young, I remember the specific kind of humiliation that I felt when I said the wrong word, and the mockery from my brothers, and how that made me forever remember one word or another. And that's part of the process of learning language as a child. And learning a second language, you're subjecting yourself to that same process again as an adult when you are more emotionally developed. So I think in this sense, I've been able to cope with that better. And also just the people that I've worked with have been nice enough not to, be cruel to me about it. But in a sense, that is the really difficult thing, that I don't feel as embarrassed about not understanding concepts in chemistry.
Yeah.
But when it's about language, and when, the very fundamental thing about being human is being able to understand conversations around you, and being able to understand this, have this understanding between two people. And when there is a disconnect there, it's really difficult in a way that learning chemistry or learning physics is not.
Yeah, I have difficulty with that comparison because I just don't have enough experience with chemistry and physics. Like, I'm just being honest with you. I don't feel I can agree or disagree with you with that last part of it, how it compares to chemistry and physics. Because I'll be honest with you, I feel like it would have been easy for me to study chemistry or physics if I had a brother who did it with me, and like an older brother, but frankly could have been a younger brother. If I had someone else encouraging me and involved in that and asking questions back and forth and discussing it, I feel like that could be a huge part for me subjectively of working on chemistry or physics, as opposed to just being completely alone with the dry facts of the textbook. So you want to say more on that? Maybe, you may disagree with something, but.
Well, I guess maybe I could ask a question. So is it about, I feel like there are two elements here. So one is the collaborative process, the difficulty of learning a language alone,
right?
And the difficulty of learning, comparing that to the difficulty of learning physics alone.
And then there's the element of humiliation.
Right. Yeah. I think.
Look, I'm just opening the possibility. Maybe that's something language learning has in common with other forms of learning, including chemistry and physics, rather than something different. Obviously, I still do think it is important for language learning.
Yeah.
I'm just not. I just am challenging the assumption that that's a unique aspect of language learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's
Yeah. So anyway, babe, I do feel that fear and humiliation are major parts of the experience of education. I've talked about that recently, and people ignore the importance of that at their peril. I mean, no, look, if you imagine language students on a spectrum, some are kind of egoically invulnerable. They don't get embarrassed. They don't feel fear and trepidation. They don't feel humiliated by getting something wrong or what have you. And I've met some people like that.
yeah.
You meet people who are the proverbial goofball.
Yeah.
You meet the guy who's just totally self-confident and suave, even when he mixed up the word sit and shit. Like he moves a chair and says, "Can I shit here?" And everyone laughs at him, and he's still completely like, you can really have language learning errors that ridiculous, in every language. That kind of error. There's something like that in every language. 2 words you can get mixed up. So you can have the person who's totally self-confident and reckless over to someone who's very conservative and very fearful and very careful in everything they say. And certainly, if you talk to people who've taught English as a second language in Japan, they talk about that a lot with their students, because it's like, well, it's so hard for me to get my students to try things and speak and answer questions, because they, with the Japanese, the way they will express themselves is that they're trying to be polite. Obviously, that's really an untranslatable cultural idiom. What politeness means in Japanese is totally different from what it means in English, culturally, not just in terms of vocabulary. But across that whole spectrum, there are people for whom language education doesn't work. There are people who put 10 years into it and they still just suck at the language. They still are just terrible at it, So it's not the case. A million YouTube channels will tell you, oh, just be a goofball, just be self-confident, just be outgoing, just go out and talk to people like me, as if that's the secret to language learning. And it's not, And there probably are some YouTube channels, maybe, Alexander Argay is an example, who say, be very studious, work at your desk, be this scholarly, reserved character, and that's the way to develop ability in language. But I just say across the whole spectrum, you meet people who failed at learning their target language in every way. But yeah, fear and humiliation is a huge part of the subjective experience of education and learning. And fear of being wrong. And yeah, I mean, I really do think it's, I think it's certainly something nobody in Polyglot YouTube wants to talk about. Nobody commercializing this kind of education and profit from it wants to talk about. And maybe, sitting alone at your desk with a dictionary, watching Japanese anime, maybe part of the problem is that you aren't experiencing that fear and risk and humiliation and pressure. Maybe the lack of that is part of what's wrong with this particular form of, commercialized polyglottery, commercialized language education. So I've already answered this question in part. Brunner asks in the audience, what would you say is the main difference between the study of language and learning skills like math or architecture that makes one of them learnable on the internet and not the other? So I've already given about 5 different answers for this, I think. I think you probably asked this question before I gave many different answers. But let's relate this to what Melissa just raised. Do you have anyone in your life who will tell you that you're wrong when you're wrong? In speaking a language, language does involve making mistakes and correction. I mean, part of language is like stand-up comedy. You only know when it's funny because you actually took the risk and got it on stage and presented it to an audience. Now, I am not, sorry, I've said it, as I say, maybe 5 different criteria whereby language acquisition is really special. It is really different from these other things. So I'm not, if you haven't seen that part of the video, go back and watch it. I think those criteria are more important. But math you know if the equation you did was right or wrong. Like math, you can literally just turn to the answers at the back of the book and you know. Language is not like that. And even with a language as easy to learn as Spanish, Italian, French, people live making the same errors again and again and again for decades, for their whole lives. You know, certainly I've seen that even in English. People are wrong in their first language, or if they speak English as a second language, and they never improve and they never get better. Now, yeah, this is one of the differences from math and architecture. You know, I mean, there are more. So look, why is it such a powerful fantasy, the escapism involved in learning a new language? I think it is because people have the apprehension or the intuition that learning a new language changes who you really are. Not just how people perceive you, which it does. It does change that. You're perceived as a different person, even if you just speak Spanish, let alone Chinese, Japanese, more challenging language. Changes the way people perceive you, okay? It changes the way you think. It changes the way you feel. It changes the way you talk about your life, obviously. It changes the way you live. In a very intimate, moment-to-moment way, it changes who you are. Now, whether you think that is shallow or profound, it's a tremendous change. Now, any one of you in the audience, wherever you're living, I think I can say this safely. There probably is a minority of people where you're living who speak Spanish. You know, sorry, like even if you're in London, England, watching this, or you're in Glasgow, Scotland, there's a Spanish minority, a Spanish-speaking minority within London, England. Okay, but obviously a lot of you are watching this in the United States, Canada. What if for 2 years you took up a challenge? This could be a great YouTube channel. Only speaking Spanish when you were outside your own home, that you wouldn't say a word of English. You'd only speak in Spanish. One of the things that's going to change is who you talk to, right? You're going to start living in a totally different community. Even if I only spoke French, my life would be totally different here, right? But I think you can begin to imagine. So look, you can watch the news in Spanish. You can read the newspaper in Spanish. Like you can do everything in Spanish anywhere in the world now, basically. You know, and again, frankly, even if you live in Beijing, China, even if you live in Taipei, there's a Spanish minority there. There really is. I've seen it in Taiwan. There is a Spanish-speaking minority there. A lot of them are from the Caribbean islands, but they speak Spanish wherever they're from. Maybe they're not from European continental Spain. Okay, whether you can imagine or not, some of you will already know exactly what I'm talking about. You will think differently. You will feel differently. You will dream differently living in Spanish for 2 years, right? So it's a big change. And I'm willing to say it's shallow rather than profound, but there's nothing else like it. You know, someone makes a joke in Laotian and you laugh and find it funny, you know, and you laugh in that split second. You don't think about it for 5 minutes and figure out, well, it's funny later. You make a joke, like, you know, so me, when I first make a joke in Laotian and people laugh and find it funny, because so maybe this is shallow. It's a big change when you find yourself struggling to remember the word for something in English. You know, English is your first language, but that's now the language where you can't remember words. It's a big change. Architecture is not like that. Math is not like that. Okay, and you know, I think a lot of people feel like learning a new language in some ways replaces their personality. The different people respond to this challenge in different ways. I think so. Look, this is provocative. I think overcoming your accent is not difficult. I think if you grew up speaking Russian, I think you continue to speak English with a Russian accent because you're retaining your Russian identity, because you're holding on to this sense of your personality and who you truly are that's rooted in Russian, because you made a decision that you're going to keep dreaming in Russian, thinking in Russian, feeling in Russian, even if you speak English 5 days a week. Like you were living in the United States of America for 20 years and you still speak English with a Russian accent. One of the most dramatic of this is French. That phonetically, there is no reason for French people to say this is as this is this thing. The way the vast majority of French people mispronounce English constantly, their whole lives. It's not difficult to overcome. With really very slight effort, they could learn to speak English without a French accent, with a neutral accent, what have you. You know, that's easy, all right? But you choose not to do it because you don't want to lose your sense of identity. I don't mean nationalism. I don't mean a political identity. I mean personal identity. There's a sense of who you really are that's attached to that language that you don't want to let go of. And, there are people born and raised in Canada, but they still have a Spanish accent. Like they went through all levels of schooling only in English, never in Spanish, but they still have a Spanish accent, and Korean and Chinese, and they never get over it, So yeah, architecture is not like that. The study of math is not like that. If there's anything else like that, I don't know what it is. And yes, language is powerfully linked to your sex life. Language is powerfully linked to religion. Language is very often powerfully linked to social status, career, who you think you are, who you want other people to perceive you as. Look, guys, I mean, it doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot to me. But when I was at the pinnacle of my ability to speak Laotian, it was very moving and very strange for me to witness Laotian people saying that I was one of them, that they said that I was Lao. They weren't flattering me. They weren't saying it to me. It would be like I'd be in a room with 5 Laotian people, and one of them would say to another, "Oh no, it's okay. He's one of us. Oh no, he's Laotian. Like he's I'd only worked in the language for a couple of years. It's true. At that moment, I could really speak quite well, like just my, within a limited vocabulary, I could really pronounce and use the language well. And it created the illusion that I was much more fluent than I was, that I had much more advanced fluency than I did. In some ways that was very touching. It wasn't there for that. I didn't want them to embrace me as their brother or something, or accept me into their culture or their nationality. It reflects a lot about who the Laotians are. Laotians will accept you in a way the Japanese never will. There are different elements to that. But yeah, beyond the question of how people perceive you and treat you, the way in which you think and feel from moment to moment changes with the study of language. And even if that's easy, the difference between French and English is easy. The difference between Spanish and English is easy. And the difference between speaking English with a French accent and speaking English without a French accent, it's really easy. That's not like learning Chinese, right? It's not like learning English, Even when it's easy, even when you're looking at a language transition that's easy, in this emotional and psychological way, it's still hard. And as I say, this probably is linked to the escapist fantasy. Talk about a nerdy white American guy who has no charisma in America. He has no charm in America, but he feels that by speaking Japanese, he can become charming. He can be charming in the Japanese language. And you know what's really fucked up? Maybe he's right. Like maybe when he tells jokes in Japanese, everyone laughs. And when he told jokes in English, nobody thought he was funny. Now, maybe he's wrong. Maybe you get to Japan, you're speaking Japanese, and you're still a dork, and nobody likes your jokes. And but for enough people, that there is a kind of transformation. Again, not just in your status, not just in how people perceive you, but in how you think, and in some sense, in who you really are. And look, sorry, again, okay, so guys, this is a real choice I have to face. What if I stop everything I'm doing, I learn Hebrew, and I start living in Israel, right? Legally, I have the right to do this because of my bloodline, right? Everything would change for me. Okay. What if I stop everything I'm doing and we go to, I don't know, some Spanish-speaking country in Latin America that'll have me? El Salvador? Do you think I can get a visa? I think El Salvador might be desperate enough for foreign investment at the moment that I move permanently to El Salvador, and Spanish becomes. Now, look, my point is not that I would ever be perceived as an Israeli living in Israel. I would never be perceived as Salvadorian living in El Salvador. I'd be perceived as an outsider, but I would be speaking that language every day, and I would have a totally different life. politically, emotionally, personally, and in so many other ways. The thing is, for me, that's not an escapist fantasy. Like, for me, there's really nothing positive about that. But for a lot of people, it's intoxicating. The possibility of that and the reality of it is intoxicating for them also. I mean, is it putting a mask on or is it taking a mask off? Right? If you go and start a new life in Japan, if you go start a new life in El Salvador, and for a lot of guys, it's taking the mask off. I've met men who went to Brazil, who went to Colombia. And again, the language isn't, I mean, learning Portuguese, learning Spanish, it's not that. And these guys were not reading in Portuguese or Spanish. It was just spoken communication. They weren't reading literature or politics or history. But, they felt like they were set free and that this is who they really were. I'm alluding to quite a lot of darkness there that I'm not actually going to describe. Yeah. So another very astute comment from Henry Gann, quote, is it not ironic that the technology that was supposed to bring us together is actually contributing to our balkanization? Okay. From my very first contact with the internet, that was what I perceived. I perceived the primary significance of the internet being balkanization in its political sense. So, look, both of my parents were communists. They were not moderate communists. They were extremists. Like, other communists regarded them as extremists. They were more crazy, more extreme than the majority of communists at that time. My parents, they had no choice before the internet. They had no choice other than joining a mainstream communist organization. Like, within Canada, there were we still see posters on the street today for the Communist Party. They're still recruiting. Okay, well, your choice is either you join that party and you put up with their version of communism, or you're alone. You're an outsider. You're shut out. You shut the door on them. And churches, even small cults, either you join this church or you have no church. Maybe there are 4 different churches in your neighborhood. Maybe there are 15, but that's it. You have a certain number of choices. What I saw on the internet was, whoa, now you can join thousands of different communist groups. Now you can join many, many thousands of different churches. Now every conceivable ideology is being catered to as a niche market. And many ideologies that are as yet inconceivable will be catered to. And yeah, I saw really extreme and eccentric forms of Buddhism, communism, fascism, what have you, that all of them were able to gather their community of followers and indeed start making money. It wasn't always about money, but whether it was about money or so, yes, I've got to tell you, I agree. But from my perspective, right from the start, that was what you saw. And you also saw the way in which that balkanization reinforced people's sense of self-confidence and dignity in doing things that otherwise would have been shameful. Various illicit forms of sex. Well, now that you have an online discussion forum where you get to meet and talk to other people who regard your particular sexual predilections as normal, like it's normal within that one Facebook group or that one Reddit group, whatever it is, right? Now that you have an internet forum of some kind where your form of drug use is reinforced as normal, right? And so on for religions, political tendencies, so on and so forth. So yeah, I was kind of horrified around 1997 when I first started thinking seriously about the internet and what the effect was in the world it would have. But I'll give you a real specific example. How to take the discarded brake pads from a truck and turn them into a wind power generator. You could learn that instantly on the internet. Before, how would you even find out that was possible, let alone get a step-by-step guide with diagrams? How to take discarded brake pads from a truck and fit them onto this thing and make a generator. Well, I was involved in ecology. I was interested in wind power generation. I saw stuff like that and I got it. I was like, wow, okay. So this is how it's going to change the world, by really, deepening the divisions between these different cult-like groups, but also deepening the groups themselves, deepening their access to information, so on and so forth, even if it's just completely pragmatic information like that. Henry Gann comments, quote, "My own abject failure at learning a second language, even Spanish, tells me that it is easier to learn organic chemistry." Yeah. You know, we can order Teach Yourself Organic Chemistry from Amazon, right? We could do a whole series of YouTube videos. Thumbs up if you'd support that idea. If we do a whole series of YouTube videos, Organic Chemistry for Dummies. We can do an organic chemistry series. We have to check. Is that title already taken? Is there already a book called Organic? We can just start doing organic chemistry, the equivalent of polyglot videos on YouTube. Study with me videos. We're going to do a whole thing for organic chemistry about how you can go from zero to hero in organic chemistry, and you can do it with us. Think there's going to be any money in that? Do you think I'm going to get laid doing that? Do you think I'm going to be able to cheat on my girlfriend through teaching organic chemistry courses? Maybe so. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you'd really get a following of people who want the encouragement and who really value you talking about your own struggle to master organic chemistry. But yeah, I think that's an example where there's no real barrier to entry. Whereas with language learning, we really do rely on these institutions that haven't changed that much in 200 years. And we don't yet have a substitute for it. But the popularity of these forms on the internet is very much based on catering to the fantasy that those institutions have become obsolete, whereas they have not. Great question from Clouds. So Melissa, I don't think you've ever heard this. Clouds asks, quote, "I remember you said you had considered Mongolia instead of Cambodia. Was the language a major factor in your decision to go to Cambodia and Southeast Asia instead of Mongolia?" So I don't know if I've ever talked to you about this. Mongolian was quite accessible to me where I was at the University of Toronto. I mean, I could get all the books I needed and audio recordings and so on. And I was really able to do quite a bit of study. You know, there's studying a language and then there's learning about the language, you know. So it wasn't that I was directly studying Mongolian as a language, but I was learning about the language and the theory and history. And for example, what the relationship was between Mongolian and the languages of India and languages of China and where the vocabulary came from and, you know, linguistics rather than, but I was able to do quite a lot of reading about Mongolian and start learning also the history of Buddhism in the country, this kind of thing. And, you know, there was one professor teaching Mongolian at University of Toronto at that time. And I think because of that professor and because of the kind of vestiges of the idea that there'd be a department for Mongolian studies at University of Toronto, there was a photo exhibition. There was an exhibition of artistic photography from Mongolia. And I stood there looking at these pictures of the barren, lifeless desert and feeling like I was staring into the jaws of death. I like desert. I quite specifically like the desert of Nevada, New Mexico, the United States. Desert is actually kind of appealing and beautiful to me as a climate. And I've been there a couple times. I've seen that, you know. But I remember those photographs and looking at those photographs and thinking, this is where you're choosing to go for the rest of your life, you know. And in case you haven't guessed, these photographs were not trying to make Mongolia look horrifying. They're trying to make it look beautiful, you know. I remember looking at that and, you know, had to admit to myself, I don't eat meat. I don't drink alcohol. These people, their culture totally revolves around eating meat and drinking alcohol. You know, this is their freezing cold climate. This is, you know, but that was the turning point, was seeing the photographs of that exhibition, you know. And it's very interesting that it had that effect on me because I actually do love the desert. I quite like desert. But I remember there were photographs of wells that had gone dry. I don't think I'm misremembering that. When there's a well, and maybe 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, it produced water, but now it's just a hole sinking into the desert, and there's nothing there but dust. And yeah, I mean, I felt a certain kind of fear, and I think I made the right choice. See, in the years since, I've met many, many people who became Mongolian specialists, Mongolian experts. And there's one guy, I didn't know him well, but I knew him well enough. He had been a sober vegetarian before he went to Mongolia to do his PhD research. When he came back, he was a pot-bellied, meat-eating alcoholic. He had ceased to be a vegetarian and had ceased to be sober. And, for what? For all the dust in Mongolia. Yeah. Yeah. Javier says that in his culture, people will mock and humiliate you if you use the right accent, and other people start to feel insecure. So it's a huge issue. It's just not the topic today, but sociolinguistics, and a huge issue within Chinese too. How comfortable are people with you speaking different languages and different dialects and different accents? And this is one of the huge differences between England and the United States of America. Americans are much more accepting of you, kind of accent neutral basis. And in England, how much money you have is totally tied to your accent. It's horrible. The class stratification of accent in England and things. Yeah. But no, it's a huge issue, the mockery and so on. But obviously, I mean, part of the fantasy of going to Japan is that because you look like a foreigner, they'll be so accepting of you. And by the way, there's some truth to this. If you meet people who are ethnically Japanese, but who grew up speaking only English and then learn Japanese as a second language, the way they are treated in Japan is much worse than being a white person or a black person who learns Japanese. And if you talk to people who are ethnically Korean, but who grew up only speaking English, then learn Korean as a second language, they're treated really badly in Korea. Whereas a white person or a black person who learned Korean is very different. So yeah. Some of those issues of judgment on accents and so on. Okay, so Larry has a series of comments, and he says, quote, maybe that's why the very act of language learning got promoted to such a status, as it could be seen as a side effect of the monotone. I think he means monotonous, but monotone, fair enough. Monotone in a poetic sense. A very monotone and habitual consumption of foreign language media. So he means watching anime from Japan, this kind of thing. Well, Larry, I disagree with you in a strange sense. I think that everyone who learns a language wants to change their life. The only exception I can think of is someone who is already married to someone. Like you get married to a Filipino woman and then you can't communicate and you try to learn Tagalog to communicate with your wife. And those people are very rarely motivated enough to learn a foreign language. Where you're trying to learn a language just to keep things the same. You're trying to learn a language that your wife won't divorce you or you can stop fighting with each other. That's very rare. But I just say, actually learning a language, Japanese, Chinese, or any of these, it will always proceed from a conviction of something has to change. Nothing is going to change unless I get off my ass and change it. I'm going to learn Japanese, or I'm going to learn Chinese, or I'm going to learn Italian, or whatever it is. And following through with that, doing all the hard work for hundreds of hours over many years, there's some kind of change people are aiming at. And frankly, I think that's why this is all worth talking about. I think a lot of people want change. Some people want political change. Some people want personal change. A lot of people want to change the culture they're living in or the political system they're living in. If you were born and raised in Indonesia, It's much easier to fantasize about learning Japanese and running away to Japan than it is to fantasize about how to create democracy and atheism in Indonesia. Isn't it easier to run away to a country that's already predominantly democratic and predominantly atheist? Look, even Russia. I mean, even running away from Morocco to learn Russian and go live in Russia. I mean, I know Russia, it's divided between atheists and Christians, but still, wow, compared to life in Morocco, compared to life in Indonesia, moving to Moscow right now would seem like paradise. Hey, you get to be surrounded by atheists, secular modern people with modern attitudes. So, again, it doesn't have to be learning Japanese. It's just the main example I'm using here. People want change, and learning a language is very hard. But compared to changing the political system in the country you live in, and compared to changing your own life in the country you live in, learning a new language will seem easy. It's easier than the other ways to get to that kind of change. And thus, it's the basis for such powerful escapist fantasies.